All right, I last left you in segment 2 with Hunter and Sandra moving to Aspen, Colorado. 1963. What was going on in 1963 in the U.S.?
The elections. No, not the election. Kennedy assassination.
Yeah, Kennedy assassination. Um, and this is just a little before that. Aspen, Colorado at the time was beginning to become a mecca of a place to be. Not only was money prevalent in Aspen, Colorado in the early 1960s, but culture. Artists from film to poetry wanted to be there. And where else to go but to Aspen? So, we're now March of 1964, the 23rd. Hunter's son is born, Juan Fitzgerald Thompson, Juan being John Fitzgerald, named after his favorite author. And he's born in Aspen, Colorado. Very quickly after the birth of Juan, they moved to Glen Ellen, California. And during this period of time, he's working for the National Observer, which was something that he had gotten a hold of in 1962. And his editor at the time said that, I want you to do something provocative. We need to sell newspapers. And he was dealing with a lot of, with a whole array of domestic and cultural issues. He didn't quite say fluff pieces, and I wouldn't consider them fluff pieces. I mean, they were informative, but they were very moderately written, non-opinionated. And at this particular point in time, he wanted to have his own opinion. He wanted to have it publicly stated. So he decides that he's going to visit Idaho, which is Ketchum, Idaho, and write a piece on the suicide of Ernest Hemingway, his second favorite author. And so he writes a piece called The Suicide of Ernest Hemingway, or, in his original version, A Visit to Ketchum. So while he's there, he's trying to figure out how this happened, because a lot would be revealed in that cabin in Idaho. And he decides, well, what the hell, I'm going to take a pair of elk antlers and bring them home with me. Well, and they were hanging on the wall in Ernest Hemingway's cabin. So that kind of, the group of people who were caretaking for that family's, for the Hemingway estate, realized that had occurred and mentioned it to his boss, and the boss kind of flubbed it off. 1965, he meets Tom Wolfe, and he becomes fast friends with Tom Wolfe, and he writes a review of the 1965 essay collection called The Candy-Colored Tangerine Flake Streamlined Baby. This is Tom Wolfe's attempt to be a subversive, and this is Hunter's first time in the real publishing world to bring that subversive, countercultural review to the surface. And so he goes to the Observer and he says, I want to do this I want you to present this review. And they refuse. So Hunter severs ties with the Observer. And decides that he's going to move to San Francisco and immerse himself into the counterculture. Now, his opinion of the counterculture was attitudes of drugs and sex. And he begins to write for The Spider, which is the local Haight-Ashbury newspaper at the time. And he meets Carrie McWilliams through his in-laws, and he becomes really good friends. During this meeting, Carrie says, "Well, you know what? I run one of the oldest magazines in the Americas, called The Nation. I'm the editor. I'm gonna do whatever the hell I want to do, and I want you to write something for me." He says, "I don't care what it is." I said, "Well, I've got this really cool review on Tom Wolfe." He says, "No, I want something even more crazy." So he decides that he is going to follow the Californian-based Hells Angels motorcycle club. And he lives with them, and he rides with them, and rides with them all over the country. And this is where he gains his appreciation for the motorcycle. And he continues his bourbon whiskey and Chivas Regal. And this is also his introduction to the drug scene. Believe it or not, before that, the worst thing he ever did was a little pot. So May 17th, 1965, it's published by The Nation magazine, and everyone is wowed. He continues to write and journal and develop and finalizes his political ideology and chooses to live and ride with the gang after the publishing of this particular article. So, early 1966, Hunter is almost stomped to death by his fellow friends. And this is a revelation for him. But it's also kind of a marketing scheme for him, because he's very good at marketing himself. And the Hells Angels thought, well, you know what, you're exploiting us for your own benefit. And that was their opinion. And his opinion was, no, I'm informing the American public of an institution that exists. Anyways, in late 1966, Random House publishes Hell's Angels, The Strange and Terrible Saga of the Outlaw Motorcycle Gangs. That's the actual title of it, by the way. And at the same time, Hunter is marketing all of this stuff through CBS. And a very good friend of his at CBS and he brings along a friend of his who is a Hells Angels gang member by the name of Skip Workman. And they work this routine out to publicize. And Skip is trying to make sense that, you know, we're not all bad guys. And he's trying to prove that, yeah, they are all bad guys, but they're good guys as well. So what does this do for Hunter? This brings Hunter into a whole new market. With all of the work that he did with The Nation, and all of the work that Random House put into publishing this novel, which was, by the way, the first novel that was published. So he begins to write for Esquire magazine, Pageant magazine, Harper's, Atlantic Monthly, and the New York Times magazine. And he begins the talk show circuit and the late night talk show circuit. And he meets a number of people who will all follow him either to the end of his life or to the end of their lives. The same time this is going on in late '66, a son is born and dies that same day, and he and his wife never named that child. But it brings up an issue for him, which is this constant mortality thing. It's just around the corner. So, William Paley gives him a phone call, the damn owner of Time magazine, and says, I want you to write an article. Whatever you want to write on, I don't care. I said, well, wait a minute. I was fired from, as a copy boy from your institution. He says, I don't care. Write something. So he writes, the Hashberry is the capital of the hippies, which is a pun on words. Haight-Ashbury is the capital of the hippies. And I'm going to read a statement, and this is straight from Hunter's book of quotes. Deriding a culture that began to lack the political convictions of the new left, the artistic core of the beat, instead becoming overrun with newcomers lacking any purpose other than obtaining drugs. That was his long-standing opinion of the hippies. Never considered himself one. And if you remember, that was the same ideal that Jack Kerouac kept on putting out there. I'm not a hippie, and I'm sure as hell not a beat. And I have a good pair of socks on. So, 1968, very early in '68, another son is born and dies that same day. And again, not a name. Yeah. And he begins to write. He's the first to sign the Writers and Editors War Tax Protest Pledge. He's the first one to sign it. And this is his first overt attempt in politics. This is his first indictment of the Vietnam War. So he begins another book called The Joint Chiefs, and he begins to travel and follow the campaign of 1968. And the Democratic National Convention in Chicago, for him, and this is his words, had the greatest effect on him in his adult life. So Hunter re-signs with Random House, and he also signs a contract with Ballantine Books. And he begins to write the Johnson Files for Ballantine, which is kind of a spoof on Lyndon Baines Johnson. Now, as you know, in '68, Lyndon Baines Johnson chooses not to seek re-election, and Ballantine Books cancels the deal. Unlike Kerouac, he doesn't sue Ballantine. He just lets it go. 1969, a daughter is born and dies within 3 days, and they name her little Anna. Hunter buys his rented house that he had in Aspen, Colorado, and names it the Owl Farm. Now everybody knows the Owl Farm as the fortified compound. In 1969, he also receives his first and only PhD from the Universal Church, which, as you know, is a signatory PhD. And after that is always known as Dr. Hunter S. Thompson. At the same time in 1969, and I'm going to read what a reviewer said for the New York Times, I praise it as an angry acknowledgement, fascinating and excitingly written book that shows Hell's Angels not so much as dropouts from society, but as total misfits or unfits, emotionally, intellectually, educationally unfit to achieve the rewards, such as they are, that the contemporary society orders to offer. That was his first book review in the New York Times. And every year after that, he received a book review. He wrote 58 books, over 11,000 articles. And the reviewer also puts this out there about Thompson. A spirited, witty, observant, and original writer. His prose crackle like motorcycle exhaust. So, in 1970, he's living in his fortified compound. He's got a skedaddle of guns. He has his son and his wife, and he's writing fervently. And he decides to rename the town of Aspen as Fat City. And he tries to get it on the ballot. But as you know, it doesn't work out that way. Also, he runs in a citizen party called the Freak Power Ticket as a sheriff of Patinkin County, which is the county that absorbs most of Aspen and its surrounding areas. And I'm going to read a quote from him on stage in front of 200 residents of Aspen, Colorado. Now, remember, Thompson shaved his head in 1970, and it stayed that way ever since. So having shaved his head, he referred to the Republican candidate as my long-haired opponent, which I thought was clever. In 1970, he pens the term gonzo journalism. And there's always been debate of what that means. And I'm going to give you the two examples of, and you can take it with you if you choose. His version is that really it's going in to the center, the core of the issue, living in it, loving it, hating it, being it, and then writing about it and fictionalizing it. That's pretty damn clear to me. The population, the people at the time, the people in the writer corps and all of the different schools in the United States, and I mean that schools as in writing schools, not as in colleges or universities, took a different theme or a different trail on that, which is let's write about something that's real and falsify it. And that was the thing that Dan was talking about. So anyways, we're going to go on to the next part of his life. And I believe Carol is up.